This lecture is part of the West Indian Soldier Heritage Project, carried out in partnership with the National Army Museum and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The War of Jenkins Ear, Success and Disaster in the Caribbean, from 1739 to 1742. The interestingly titled War of Jenkins Ear takes its name from an incident in 1731, in which the merchant ship of British Captain Robert Jenkins was boarded by a Spanish guarda-costa in the Caribbean on the allegation that Jenkins was conducting illicit commerce. The story, the truth of which has been debated by historians ever since, states that the Spanish captain, Juan Leon Fandino, cut off Captain Jenkins' ear, saying that he would have done the same to King George if he were there. 7 years later, in 1738, Captain Jenkins visited Parliament in London to tell his story to the House of Commons, carrying a bottle which held his preserved ear. In light of deteriorating relations with Spain, his story, be it true or false, helped to whip up anti-Spanish sentiment, leading to the declaration of war against Spain. In truth, although this possibly mythical incident gave the war its name, its causes lay in economic matters. Spanish vessels had overstepped the mark by stopping foreign vessels in their mission to prevent illicit commerce, often stopping such ships in open sea with no proof as to their destination. On the other side, the British had abused their trading privileges with Spain, including their right under the Asiento system to provide the Spanish-American colonies with a fixed number of slaves, and their right to send one ship a year to Spanish South America for trade. These arrangements were up for renewal in 1744, and as things stood, there was no chance that they would be. The opposition in Parliament thus forced Sir Robert Walpole's government into a more warlike stance. Negotiations between Spain and Britain broke down in July 1739, leading to Britain declaring war on 19th of October the same year. A fleet was sent to the Caribbean under the command of Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, an experienced officer who had served in the region for 4 years during the War of the Spanish Succession. Vernon believed that the Spanish Empire in the New World could be split in two and forced to crumble by seizing the cities of Porto Bello, in modern-day Panama on the Central American coast, and Cartagena, in modern-day Colombia in South America. In this early stage of the war, there was no role for the army, and Vernon's fleet was made up of the navy and of marines. He had been given no specific orders to attack land settlements in the Caribbean, although he had been directed to gather information. However, after Vernon's fleet had arrived in the Caribbean and spent a few weeks at Jamaica, he resolved to attack Porto Bello. He arrived on the 20th of November 1739 with a force of 6 ships and captured the town with ease. There was no advantage to trying to hold on to the city, as it was quite small and sparsely populated for most of the year, until the annual visit of the trading galleons. But the British decided to destroy all of the fortifications. The news of Vernon's success was met with jubilation in Britain, a response that was in truth not entirely warranted, as the popular imagination held that Portobello was a far more difficult military target than was actually the case. Nevertheless, Vernon's success made him a household name, with victory medallions, such as this one depicted, made in his honour. The name Portobello became widespread, with various locales being named after the victory, hence the existence of the district of Portobello in Edinburgh and Portobello Road in London, as well in other cities throughout the British Empire. Many streets and places were also named after Vernon himself. In light of this victory, other operations in the Caribbean were planned, targeting both Havana, in Cuba, and Cartagena, in modern-day Colombia. A large military force was assembled for this purpose, although it took a considerable amount of time to come together. Part of the army's force came from the North American colonies. This colonial contingent, around 3,600 men in total, came from 9 of the 13 colonies, and included in their number a Captain Lawrence Washington, the older brother of America's first president, George. The American contingent arrived in Jamaica before the end of 1740, where they immediately began suffering from the ill effects of the Jamaican climate, including fever and the dangers of too much rum. In Britain, the men were assembled on the Isle of Wight under the command of Major General Lord Charles Cathcart. These were largely raw recruits and boys, and one of Cathcart's subordinates, Brigadier General Thomas Wentworth, had to train them to a minimum standard. There were, as ever, many delays, and the men, 6,000 of them, spread amongst 8 regiments, did not depart successfully until the 4th of November 1740, 4 months behind schedule. The fleet reached the Caribbean over a month later, arriving at Dominica, where sickness had already begun to spread amongst the men. Lord Cathcart died, with the burden of command falling upon Wentworth. The fleet eventually made its way to Jamaica and rendezvoused with the American contingent and Vernon's force. Considering their options, they decided to challenge what they believed was the weaker target between the two, Cartagena. They set sail on the 25th of February and arrived on the 15th of March. After several days of launching feints, the British began their attack, bombarding the Spanish defences from the sea. The plan was to force their way through the Boca Chica, the small mouth at the entrance to Cartagena's large harbour, and then continue on to the city itself, overcoming the forts in the interior coastline along the way. The Spanish defenders were driven back into Fort San Luis, and the army under Wentworth was landed to capture it. However, it was here that the problems truly began. Wentworth, for all his skill at training soldiers, had no practical experience in the field. His subordinate officers were also not very experienced, nor indeed were his men, although they had received some much-needed rudiments of training from him whilst they were on the Isle of Wight. Instead of storming the fort straight away, which Vernon believed to be the right course of action, Wentworth decided to establish a large camp near the shoreline, as well as building a battery to continue pounding away at Fort San Luis. This lost the expedition valuable time, gave the Spanish more opportunities to shore up their defences, and worse yet, gave the men more exposure to the threat of disease, and many indeed began to fall sick. Whilst Wentworth continued these preparations, Vernon landed a small group of American troops to attack the batteries on the Boca Chica's other shore on the 30th of March, to prevent them from harassing the fleet. Led by Lawrence Washington, the attack was successful, with the Americans moving at speed to prevent the guns of the second battery being turned on them. The British battery finally opened fire on the 2nd of April and successfully silenced what remained of the fort's guns, but Wentworth still hesitated in his assault until he was prompted by Vernon. The fort was successfully stormed on the 5th. By this point, the operation had cost 130 men either killed or wounded, but with over 250 dead from illness, and over 600 men in the hospital. Following the successful but slow capture of the Boca Chica and Fort San Luis, Vernon felt that victory was in his grasp, but it took a week for the army to be re-embarked and carried up to the head of the harbour, putting it within striking distance of the main fortifications and Cartagena itself. In the meanwhile, the British were able to secure the defences at Fort Manzanilla and Fort Santa Cruz. Once landed, the army's target was Fort San Lazaro, known also as the Castillo San Felipe, which Vernon and his naval commanders believed could successfully be stormed with a mere 1,500 men. Wentworth disagreed and insisted that his full complement be landed, which the admirals agreed to do, but urged him to move swiftly, reminding him of the dangers of the delay and the approach of the rainy season. Yet Wentworth went about setting up the same elaborate camp as before, much to Vernon's annoyance, and the admiral continued to urge him to continue the attack, as apparently did Wentworth's own engineers. The Spanish used this delay to their advantage, working to improve their defences. In the end, Wentworth was finally convinced to storm the fort. The attack was made on the morning of 20th of April, 1741, with 1,500 men. Some Spanish deserters, or locals, offered to guide the British troops, and they departed their camp at 4 o'clock in the morning. The guides, either by intentional design, led the British astray, and the first of the 2 British columns found themselves approaching the fort up a slope so steep it required them to ascend on their hands and knees. When they reached the top, it was already broad daylight, and they found themselves easy prey for the Spanish musket fire. On the other side, the second column also came under fire, and the troops called for their siege ladders. However, the American colonials, who had been carrying these ladders, had thrown them down and fled. The ladders would have been of no use, as the Spanish had been able to dig a trench around the fort during the delay, which meant that the British ladders would have been too short, although it may still have been possible to take the fort with a coordinated rush. Wentworth gave no order to retreat, and his force remained in the open, maintaining formation, returning the Spanish fire as best they could, until he finally gave the order to retire at 8 o'clock. 43 British officers and 136 of their men were dead, with a further 475 wounded. Colonel Grant, who had commanded the second column, was mortally wounded in the engagement. He commented in what may have been his last words, "The general ought to hang the guide, and the king ought to hang the general." In light of this failure, with scores of men still falling prey to disease, it was decided to call off the campaign. After a brief armistice to collect the wounded and dead, the British began to fall back, destroying the captured Spanish defences as they went. Before departure, time was taken to bury the dead on shore, although many soldiers, not understanding the difficulties of burial at sea, threw the bodies of many of their fallen comrades over the sides of the ships, where they were eaten by sharks and other sea creatures, turning the sea into a charnel house. The last British ship did not depart until the 20th of May, and the force retreated to Jamaica. Despite the falling number of men suitable for service, the decision was taken that another attack should be made, this time on Cuba. The fleet sailed on the 23rd of August and anchored in Guantanamo Bay on the 29th, which Vernon named Cumberland Bay after Prince William, Duke of Cumberland. Vernon urged Wentworth to take a force of 1,000 men and with an additional 1,000 bearers that they had brought from Jamaica, and travel overland to take Santiago, Cuba's second city, by surprise, a distance of some 90 miles. It is possible that such a feat could have succeeded, at least in the hands of a bold and experienced commander, but Wentworth was unwilling, and the army continued to languish in southern Cuba for several months, with sickness continuing to worsen. By the middle of November there were barely enough men for guard duty, and by the beginning of December there were less than 300 privates fit for duty, and the decision was finally taken to return to Jamaica. Of the men that had originally been assembled on the Isle of Wight, 9 out of 10 were now dead. Reinforcements were sent in February 1742, but these 3,000 men began to sicken as soon as they arrived, which limited any future operations. A second attack on Porto Bello was attempted, but by the time the fleet arrived there, the rate of sickness and death was such that the attack was called off. This marked the end of major operations in the region. The War of Jenkins Ear ultimately merged into the wider War of the Austrian Succession, fought over the right of the daughter of Emperor Charles VI to inherit her father's territories. This was largely fought in Europe between the great powers of that continent, and ultimately ended by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. In the Caribbean, the delay of the army at Cartagena demonstrated two of the recurring issues in Caribbean warfare. First, the need for swift action in the face of disease, which slowly consumed European armies that were sent to the region. Secondly, the need for close, harmonious cooperation between army and navy, showing that the British military had still not fully learned the lessons of previous conflicts in the West Indies. However, many of these lessons would be applied effectively in the next large-scale conflict Britain fought in the region, the 7 Years' War. For more information about this topic, as well as the history and heritage of the Caribbean and the work of the West India Committee, please visit us at westindiacommittee.org. Thank you.